Hello, and welcome to LSET Tech Bytes. Today we are create a simple typing test using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's go through it line by line to understand how it works. We'll start with the basic structure of our HTML file. First, we define the document type as HTML. This tells the browser that we're working with an HTML5 document. Next, we have our HTML tags, which enclose the entire document inside the HTML tags. We have the head and body sections. In the head section, we include meta tags for responsive design, set the title of the document. Now let's move on to the body section, where the content of our typing test will go. First, we have an H1 tag with the text typing test. This will be the title of our page. Next, we have a div with the class container. This container will hold all the elements of our typing test. Inside the container, we have another div with the class stats to display the timer and mistake count. In the stats div, we have two paragraphs, one for the time and one for the mistakes. We use span tags with ID timer and mistakes to dynamically update these values with JavaScript. Next, we have a div with the ID quote where the typing quote will be displayed. We've added on mouse down and on select start attributes set to return false to prevent users from copying the text. Below the quote div, we have a text area with the ID quote input where users will type the quote. It has a placeholder that prompts users to start typing when the test begins. Next, we have two buttons, one to start the test and one to stop it. These buttons have ID start test and stop test respectively, and are linked to the start test and display result functions in JavaScript. Finally, we have a result div that will display the accuracy and speed of the user after they finish the test. It contains an H3 tag for the title and another wrapper div with two paragraphs for accuracy and speed. We're also linking to a custom style sheet called style.css. This is where we'll define the styles for our typing test app at the bottom of our HTML file. We're linking to a JavaScript file called script.js. This is where we'll write the code to make our typing test app interactive. Let's dive into the CSS code and see how we're styling our typing test app to make it user-friendly and attractive. Let's start with the basic styles applied to all elements using the universal selector. The asterisk selector applies styles to all elements. We set padding and margin to 0, ensure that the box sizing is set to border box, and use the Arial, Helvetica, sans serif font family. For the H1 tag, we center align the text, add a margin at the top to give it some space from the top of the page, and set the color to a dark gray. Moving on to the container class, we set its width to 80 minutes to ensure it scales nicely across different screen sizes. We add padding for some inner space, and set the background color to a soft orange. We use the position property set to absolute to center the container in the viewport, using top, 40% and left, 50%. The transform property helps to perfectly center it by translating it by -50% in both the X and Y directions. We also add a border radius of 10 pixels for rounded corners and a box shadow to give it a subtle depth effect. Next, let's look at the stats class. We align the text to the right, set the font size to 18 pixels, and give it some margin at the bottom. We also use flexbox to space out the items evenly and align them in the center. For the span elements inside stats, we increase the font weight to 600 and set the font size to 20 pixels. The quote ID is styled to justify the text, add margins to create space around it, and set the color to a dark gray. For the text area, we prevent resizing, set its width to 100%, add padding for better text spacing, and give it a border radius for rounded corners. The font size is set to 16 pixels. The button styles include centering it, setting a bright red background with white text, removing borders, adding padding, rounding the corners, and setting the cursor to pointer. We also ensure it takes up the full width. Finally, we have the result class. Initially, it's hidden using display none. When it's shown, it will have a margin at the top. The result H3 tag is center aligned and has a larger font size. The wrapper class is a flexbox container that spaces out its children. The span elements inside the wrapper have a bold font weight. We also add success and fail classes to style the result text with green and red colors respectively. Now let's move on to the JavaScript part where we'll add functionality to our typing test app. We have a constant quote API URL that stores the URL of the API we'll use to fetch random quotes. Then we get references to the quote section and user input elements from our HTML by their ID. Next, we declare variables for the quote, time limit, timer, and mistakes counter. Now let's create a function to fetch and render a new quote from the API. This is an asynchronous function named render_new_quote. We start by fetching the data from the API and converting the response to JSON. The quote text is stored in the quote variable. We then split the quote into individual characters and wrap each character in a span element with the class quote_chars. Finally, we join these span elements into a string and set the inner HTML of quote section. Next, we add an event listener to the user input. This will track the user's typing and compare it to the quote characters. Inside this event listener, we convert the node list of quote_chars to an array and split the user's input into individual characters. For each character in the quote, we check if it matches the corresponding character in the user input. If the characters match, we add the success class to the quote character. If there's no corresponding user input character, we remove any existing success or fail classes. If the characters don't match, we add the fail class and increment the mistakes counter. We also check if all characters have the success class, indicating the user has correctly typed the entire quote. If so, we call the display result function. Now, let's look at the timer functionality. We have an update timer function that decrements the time and updates the timer display. If the time reaches 0, we call the display result function. The time reduce function sets the time to 60 seconds and starts a timer that calls update timer every second. The display result function shows the results section, stops the timer, disables the user input, and calculates the typing speed and accuracy. We display these results in the respective elements. The start test function initializes the test by resetting the mistakes counter, starting the timer, enabling the user input, and hiding the start button while showing the stop button. Finally, we have the window.onload function that initializes the page when it loads. It resets the user input, displays the start button, hides the stop button, disables the user input, and renders a new quote. And that's it for the JavaScript part. We've now added functionality to our typing test. You can start the test, type the quote, and see your typing speed and accuracy at the end. For regular updates, please hit the like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching and happy coding.